I'm a senior analyst in the telecom practice at TBR. My email and Twitter is there if you want to contact me, feel free. So before we jump into the content, I just want to give an idea of what TBR does so that everybody kind of has an idea here. So my group, this is my group's portfolio. So we cover the telecom vendors, we cover the telecom operators, and we cover under that market research umbrella all the big buzzwords in the market. So specifically NFV SDN being one of those, 5G, and we also cover web scale. So the hyperscale players is another area where we've been writing quite a bit about. Some of you might have been on webinars we've done on those topics as well. But for today, we're just going to be focusing on NFV SDN. So before we show any numbers or the insights, I just want to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of the taxonomy, because what I've noticed is some people's definitions of NFV SDN can be a little different. Also, how they size the market and think about the market can be different. So in this slide, we have the full breadth of the taxonomy that we use when we think about the NFV SDN market. So the numbers that we're going to be showing include all of the CapEx and external OpEx made by telecom and cable operators that is on or related to NFV SDN hardware, software, and services. So that includes all of the VNFs, that includes all of the MANO components. So we use the ETSI framework we align with that. It includes all aspects of SDN, so the transport layer, the switching and routing layer. It includes the full life cycle of services that is directly related to NFV and SDN technology environments. So this also implicates the cloud. So the cloudification of networks is a critical component of these NFV SDN architectures, right? These environments. So for instance, VNFs residing in a cloud-native state in a cloud environment, right? Being delivered from a cloud. So we include some of the cloud-related spend as well. That would be the NFVI component, that foundational component from which you house the VNFs. All of that spend related to those environments is included in our numbers. So we provide breakouts across NFV, SDN, and services specifically. Then we also break it out by CapEx and external OpEx. We also show breakouts from the hardware, software, services, and then by tier of operator. So we have three tiers of operators we do a breakdown on, and then by the four major regions. So we're going to be showing some data from some of these configurations. And just before we jump in here, if anybody has questions, just keep them in the chat function, and we will address all of them in order at the end of the presentation. So let's set the stage here. So between last year's market forecast and the update, a lot has changed in the market. A lot has also not changed in the market. But basically, there's a few things that are worth noting here and some assumption adjustments that we had to make in terms of how this market is going to develop over the next 5 years, which is how far our forecast goes out. One of the biggest things that we are seeing is that CapEx spend in telcos is relatively flat to down, right? It's flat with a negative bias on a global basis. That's what we see. We see CapEx guidance being in that range, generally speaking, on a global basis. What the telcos are doing is they are redistributing existing CapEx and external OpEx rather than increasing their net CapEx and OpEx spend. And what they're doing is allocating more dollars towards NFV SDN related initiatives while reducing spend on legacy, AKA traditional type platforms. So those black box, on-premise type hub and spoke models that they have traditionally deployed, that type of framework is going away and the market is shifting towards this new architecture, which is a cloudified and virtualized network architecture. The second big thing that we are seeing here is Tier 1 operators are driving the majority of the spend. And we're going to look at some of the data cuts to show the magnitude that is being spent by Tier 1s versus the Tier 2s and 3 operators. However, the operators are encountering challenges with these transformations, right? These are fundamental changes to the architecture of their networks. It's a paradigm shift. This is not easy stuff to migrate towards. And it requires significant changes in skill sets of the employees. It requires understanding of software-oriented architectures, so programming skills are very important here. It requires an understanding of the convergence of CT and IT technologies. It requires an understanding of cloud-based frameworks and those delivery models. It requires all of these differences from what the traditional way of doing networking entailed, and that poses a challenge for the telcos because they're having to reskill their workforces, they're having to bring in skill sets from other avenues, and it's slowing down the process of this migration. Some other challenges that they're encountering is technology interoperability is not panning out in a orderly fashion. So think about this as the vendor solutions do not talk well with each other, and that is a critical point for moving to a fully cloud-native type environment, because you can have multi-vendor VNFs operating in a particular framework, interfacing with each other to do things like service chaining and service orchestration. So that's another challenge that they're running into. And also cultural resistance within the telcos is stalling some of these implementations and how fast they're able to move here. So you've got the technology challenges, you've got the people-oriented challenges, and you have the vendor challenges whereby they are resisting this change because it's disrupting their own business models. So net-net, this is slowing the pace of how fast we expect the market to develop. And we did take down our forecast, the rate of the ramp. We did tone it down a little bit. But we do expect the growth to be to follow a more linear path rather than a parabolic growth curve as operators gradually make progress on their software-mediated networking transformation initiatives. So, with this as a backdrop, let's look at some of the numbers. This is an adoption curve of operator for NFV SDN for operators. And essentially, what we see here is we had to move the timeline out by 2 years. So originally, last year when we did our forecast, we thought that the market would ramp and we'd start to attain mainstream adoption in the 2020 timeframe. We've pushed that out 2 years now. So now we're saying around 2022, we're going to see mainstream adoption among telecom operators of NFV SDN type functionality. So what does that mean? How did we consider an operator to be considered adopted? So they have to be at some point in the commercial implementation process of at least one VNF. So if they have done that in a commercial environment, we consider that they have adopted NFV SDN. If they are still in the POC phase or the lab trial phase or the pre-deployment phase, pre-commercial deployment phase, we did not consider them as adopted yet. So that's how we built this curve, and it has to be at least one VNF. So it could be a firewall, it could be a virtual router, it could be EPC, it could be IMS, session border controllers, it could be any number of different VNFs. It could be software defining the transport layer, building in SDN controllers in that framework. Any of those things were considered in our build out of this adoption curve. And then laggards are going to be mid to late 2020s. So what you're going to see here is the early adopters. We're going to be the AT&Ts of the world, the Verizons of the world, NTT, all those tier one, those big name tier one operators, they are all considered early adopters, having commercially deployed at least one VNF in a commercial setting. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit more. So this graphic is from our customer adoption study for NFV SDN. So here we actually speak with operators, people that are qualified within the telcos about how they are deploying these technologies. So we are speaking with procurement people, people in the network planning, the architects. We're talking with those types of roles within the operators. We spoke with a fairly diversified cross-set of operators across geos, and this is what they told us. So basically, the darker the color, the more widely adopted that particular domain has been within these telcos. So we spoke with 18 distinct telecom operators in this study. All of them were tier ones. So just so that you understand who we spoke with at these companies. So this shows 18 tier one operators globally. This is what they said they are doing and what their roadmaps look like for NFV SDN adoption and deployment timeframe. So as we can see here, mobile core, so the VEPC, SD-WAN, those are the ones that those are being most widely deployed. They're also the ones that are deployed. Many of these were deployed in 2017. This graph's about 6 months old now. But at that time when we did the study, they were already in the process of commercially deploying within 2017. And what we see here is as we move down the list, we've got other different domains that are being slated for virtualization. The access layer of the network, the edge components of the network, the core components of the network. We've got the on-premise CPE being virtualized. So what we see here is a broad set of domains are being slated for, if they haven't been virtualized or in process of being virtualized already, they will be at least through the early 2020s, which is the furthest out end of the time frame we asked them. So the lightest colors you see here is 2023. So basically mid-2020s, furthest out on the curve there is where those operators expect to be virtualizing those particular domains. So if we take this slide and the feedback we got from operators, what they told us, and we map that with the adoption curve, we start to, that helps us express some of the numbers. The third component that we layered in to our forecast is how the operators are positioning and how far along they are in their transformation towards NFV SDN. So the operator names that you see on this slide are the names that are the furthest along in terms of their transformations towards software-mediated networking environments. So now again, we're in the early innings here, right? The industry is facing some challenges that's delaying the process, but on a relative basis, so telco versus telco, these are the companies that are furthest along on a relative basis. So AT&T is the leader. They've been virtualizing a broad range of applications, and they're using them internally as well as offering them to their enterprise customers. They're also actively building out the cloud backbone from which they are delivering these VNFs and orchestrating these VNFs on a global basis. Verizon, Telefonica, DT, Vodafone, Orange, those companies, that next tier of companies there are some of the largest telcos in the world. They are also actively engaged in deploying and trialing some of these technologies. And then as we move down on the position chart, we're going to see a mix of emerging market operators. We'll see some cable operators here. Generally speaking, most of these are tier 1 operators on this chart, and that's one of the key takeaways, is that these are the guys that are really driving the market from an aggregate spend perspective. So if you look at how much money is being plowed into the NFV SDN space, these are the names that are driving the majority of the money. And then how we plotted them is on the right-hand side here. So if you, if you're reading that, that's how we plotted them in case there were any questions there. Okay, so let's get into the numbers. So total market spend on NFV SDN in the telecom vertical. And by the way, this includes cable operators as well, because companies like Comcast are spending quite a bit of money in this area as well. So despite the market challenges, we do expect the spend to grow at a 64% CAGR from 2017 to 2022, and we expect the market to hit $110 billion by 2022. Now, the CAGR is kind of high, right? It's because it's coming off a small base. 2017, you're looking at around $10 billion was spent last year globally on NFV SDN related initiatives within these telcos. So that's why the CAGR is kind of high. As you see there, the growth rate trends downward if you look at that line. Now, some people think that the spend is kind of high. So I do want to put some context around this number and why it makes a lot of sense. So global telco CapEx spend is around $340 billion a year. And it's going to be roughly flat over the next 5 years. Now, if we take that number and we add external OPEX, you get another $150-ish billion globally. So basically what we're saying is there's $500 billion, $500 billion in money that is, available to the vendor community to sell into telco accounts, telco and cable accounts. So what we're saying basically is around a quarter of that market by 2022 is going to be allocated towards NFV and SDN. That makes a lot of sense given the digital transformation trends that we're seeing, where operators are trying to move, especially the more sophisticated operators in terms of media convergence, and digital transformation, becoming digital service providers. So essentially, around 25% of their spend by 2022 will be allocated directly towards NFV and or SDN related initiatives. Okay, so let's parse the market a little bit more. Let's lift up the hood and look a little bit more under the covers here. So what we did is we took that number, so that forecast, and we broke it across services, software, and hardware. Now, this is where it gets interesting because one of the key reasons for implementing NFV SDN is to decouple the hardware layer from the software layer. And it's to commoditize the hardware layer. So you spend less on the total solution, right? The technology solution. So we see hardware spend is growing through most of the years here. When we get to 2022, we expect the hardware market to be flat. That's a big deal. Because when you look at the vendor business models in this market, the incumbents, their entire business is predicated on selling hardware refreshes, right? So that business model is under direct attack from this trend because all of the value in the network of the future is going to be in the software layer. It's going to be in the VNFs that are decoupled from the hardware layer and that are in a cloud-native state. So the software layer there, you see that's growing. That is growing at the fastest CAGR as the value and the spend shifts increasingly towards that software layer. And the services percent of total spend is going to remain relatively flat at around 25-ish% of total spend over each year. And that's for various reasons, right? Because you need to support these environments. There's a significant amount of professional services required to integrate these environments. There's also a significant amount of spend on outsourcing. If a operator wants to outsource the complexity to a vendor, there's that spend represented here as well. So the big takeaway here is this is happening. This is happening in incumbent vendor business models, and we're seeing them positioning more and talking more about the software layer and trying to shift their business models more towards that area of the business, adopting new monetization models like a SaaS model, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Next slide. Here, we're going to be talking about the regions. So we have the 4 main regions here. There's a few key takeaways I want everybody to leave here with. The first one is the spend, the actual dollars, is driven by the States and Europe. The US and Europe are going to drive around 70% of the global spend on NFV SDN over this forecast period. That's on average, 70-ish%. That's a big deal. Then you have everybody else. So AT&T, Verizon, even T-Mobile and Sprint, they're also investing at varying levels. In Europe, we've got all the big names are making this important. Telefonica, Vodafone, BT, DT, Orange, all those companies are Telenor, Telia, all those companies are making NFV SDN critical for their networks as they architect them to be in a more digitally transformed state. So that's where a lot of the raw spend is going to be occurring, even though many operators will be adopting these technologies over the forecast period in the emerging markets as well as in the developed markets. So let's look at this a little bit differently now. We have the market size broken out by tier of operator and tier 1, 2, and 3 operators. So the way that we segmented the operators is by subscriber counts. So if any operator has 50 million or more subs, they're a tier 1. If they have 5 million to 50 million subs, they're a tier 2. And if they have less than 5 million subscribers, we consider them tier 3. Now, if they're an opco, we added the subs for each of their opcos together to get a total sub count, okay? So that's very important because some companies have many different opcos or they own stakes in many different opcos. We aggregated all of those together to make sure that we capture the tier 1s here appropriately. So what we see here is the vast majority of the spend is coming from the tier 1s. These guys are driving the market. At least 65%, it's over each year here, over 65% is going towards, more than that, is just the tier 1s here. So I think it's around, the average number was, I think, it was over 70% of the spend on average through the forecast period is just tier 1 spend on NFV SDN. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is the smaller operators are struggling financially in many cases. You know, they don't have the financial wherewithal or the skills required to do these transformations. So that's one aspect here. The other aspect is the smaller operators are showing a tendency to wait for the market to mature before they decide to jump in and start adopting. So there's a little bit of wait and see going on. They're waiting for the tier 1s to take the lead, to standardize and figure out best practices toward implementation of these technologies before they approach it themselves. So there's different reasons that we're seeing and that we're hearing about as to why it's the tier 1s driving this. And the tier 2s and 3s, generally speaking, being laggards. Now, there are some exceptions here. There are some operators that are among tier 2, like a Swisscom, for example, that are moving very quickly on NFV SDN. But so just keep in mind, we're talking in general terms here. There are some exceptions to that. Okay. So I did leave plenty of time for questions, so we're going to just go through the key takeaways here, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So there's challenges in the market, right? We are aware, some of the companies that are represented on this call are keenly aware of some of the challenges in this market. However, operators are under very strong pressure to transform, and some of them are going to push forward with NFV SDN investment, right? They kind of have to do it because their futures are highly dependent on them getting this right. The old way of doing things is not going to work in the digital world, the data economy, right? Their business models need to change. The architecture of their networks need to change in response to that. And they need to be more competitive with the hyperscalers, the OTT type companies out there. They need to evolve. They need to evolve from CSPs to DSPs. And NFV SDN is a critical component of having the right network to support a digital service provider. And the benefits of NFV SDN are numerous, right? The flexibility of the architecture, the agility that it gives operators, the efficiency gains that are realizable, so the cost savings component, also the ability to respond to market changes much quicker. The benefits are significant, and they kind of have to do this, right? It's not a question of if, it's more of a question of when. The operators are going to migrate and start to pursue these transformations at scale. We do believe that the challenges are going to be worked through. Anytime there's a new technology or approach towards technology, there usually are challenges. There's usually a people problem component to it. There's also technical challenges associated with it. We do think that the ecosystem will mature. It might take a few more years, but it will ultimately mature, and we do expect NFV SDN spend to scale at least through the 5 years that we are projecting out from here. So with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if anybody has a question, just add it to the chat function, and I'm literally just going to go right down the list here and answer each question. So the first question is where you expect first adoption. Is it the edge? Is it the aggregation points? Or is it the central office? So it's a mix. It depends on the telco. What I've personally seen is a mix of all of those. I have seen some core implementations, so central offices re-architected as data centers. Some people consider that the edge. Some people consider that the access point. I've seen it in the core network. There's been some work by some operators. I've seen it in further out from the central office, out in the field on more of the access layer. So it really depends on the telco, what type of technology they're looking to implement these types of technologies on top of. And I've also seen it on the long-haul transport. So submarine cables, putting SDN controllers in that framework to more dynamically route traffic. These are all things that I've seen. So it's a mix of all those. And the next question is, what comprises the hardware slice of spend? So the hardware includes the NFVI component. So it's the white boxes that are required. It could be a white box. It could be a gray box. It could even be a black box that has VNF functionality, right? So it's whatever physical appliance, physical box is being utilized for that NFV SDN environment. So it could be white boxes in a cloud environment. It could be an on-premise UCPE box that is bringing the VNF functionality into an on-premise environment. It's all of those different boxes we include in our hardware spend slice. So the next question is, who are the losers in the shift to NFV SDN? So let's put it this way. The more exposure to the box you have, the more in trouble you are, because the future is, the decoupling is happening. The value is in the software layer and also some of the services that are provided around that stack. So anybody that has exposure to software and or software-related services, I would say is best positioned to make this transition into the digital era and support the customer requirements in the digital era. The next question is, services are enablers, so are they around 25%? I think that question got cut off, so if you want to re-ask that, I can address it then. The next question is, are service providers adopting subscription models with the shift to NFV SDN, and at what rate? So that depends. So service provider procurement departments are oriented towards the traditional way of procuring, and they are struggling in many cases to understand and orient themselves toward the new consumption models. So what we're seeing is a lot of confusion within the telcos and within the vendors that are trying to sell into the telcos. Again, the models are relatively new, and there is some confusion around best practices and around getting resources to understand these new models and to optimize the organizations to interface with these new consumption models. So is it happening? Absolutely. But there's some challenges there, and the operators still have a ways to go with standardizing and standardizing and understanding what they want, how they want to procure it, and the vendors need to be responding, in a way that the operators want to be procuring this infrastructure going forward. So the next question is, what if they don't do transformation? What are the financial risks? So, we all see voice revenue is going away. It's being replaced by data revenue. Data revenue is going unlimited, and the price per gig is coming down that the telcos are able to charge. So connectivity rates are coming down, right? This is a global phenomenon. This has been going on for years. The problem is we're getting to a point where capacity is growing, the traffic is growing so fast, driven by video, that the telcos can't keep up anymore, right? And they need to bend the economic curves so that they can continue to extract an economic profit from their core business while they transition to these new business models. So if they keep their network architectures the way that they've traditionally had them, the old way of doing things, they're going to see significant margin erosion, and, that has significant financial risks, right? They might not be able to meet debt obligations. You might see credit rating cuts, and it's a self-fulfilling negative feedback loop from there. So the telcos need to evolve. They must evolve, not only the technical aspects of their business, but also the business aspects of their business, right? The business models need to change. How they work with their partners needs to change. How they interface with vendors needs to change. There's a lot of changes that are coming from this paradigm shift from this traditional way of doing things to the new, more digital way of doing things. So the next question is, when telcos are looking to make these transformative decisions, are they turning to external vendors for expertise or software to assist? And if so, who? So they're turning to both, but mostly turning to the services organizations of the vendors. So they're going to either the OEMs or they're going to third-party providers like IT services companies like an Accenture or an IBM. They're going to the Tech Mahindras of the world, Infosys, TCS. I see all those companies winning business in this space. They go to Amdocs, and they're also going to the OEMs that make the boxes. So there's a variety of players that they're going to. But in terms of the more higher level transformative type understandings here, they're going to management consulting firms and IT services firms. That's where I see most of the thought leadership coming from. And that's where the higher ranking officials within the telcos are going to for guidance and advisory, consultative type services to get answers to some of their questions. So the next question is, do you see colo play a role in some carriers' NFV deployments? Absolutely. So colocation is extremely important. Equinix, Digital Realty, some of the smaller players, the more regional players, they're all winning business from this trend. And essentially, they provide the foundations for a distributed cloud framework, and the telcos are piggybacking on that to bend the economics and make it more economically feasible to build out some of these environments and to scale out into other markets where they might not have had presence. So absolutely, colo has a play here. The next question is, what has caused the operator mainstream adoption timeline to be moved out to 2022 from 2020? So we mentioned some of the challenges they're encountering. There's the people-oriented challenges, the cultural aspects, the resistance that they face. There's also the technology interoperability challenges. Some of the vendors are not working nice together to make true orchestration possible. There is some, there's internal politics within the telcos that's stifling some of this from happening. So those are some of the challenges that they're encountering here that is caused us to push it out a couple of years. The next question is, what impacts are you seeing in changes to the OSS BSS architecture specifically as a result of NFV SDN? What areas of OSS BSS are changing the most? So let's take BSS, right? Billing. So revenue sharing type models are going to be much more prevalent in the digital era. We already see OTT players implementing these types of frameworks, right? So the telcos need to make more agile OSS BSS platforms so that they can provide a more digital experience to their end users. Now, in order to do that on the back end, you need a degree of virtualization and cloudification to provide that type of an experience. So that's really where it's implicating OSS BSS, is the evolution of those areas to support the NFV SDN. Now, from an OSS standpoint, network management systems need to become more cloudified in nature. They need to be unencumbered from the box or from one particular vendor's boxes, and it needs to be more comprehensive, looking at the entirety of the network, right? From the endpoint all the way through to the core of the network, there needs to be visibility there. So OSS that's implicating OSS as well. Okay, next question. Is your hardware forecast all x86 servers, or is there switchgear as well, storage boxes, racks, UPC? So yes, all of those are in there. But most of the spend, if I were to break that hardware bucket down, a lot of it is servers. Most of the spend is servers. There is switching in there, although we kind of broke switching out separately actually in that slide. Yeah, switching's in that particular slide in the hardware bucket. And there's also UCPE. So it's not only the servers residing in a data center environment, it's also the on-premise boxes that are the appliances that are being consumed by the enterprise customers. So all of those boxes are in the hardware numbers. The next question is, given the extreme cost pressures for operators and given that NFV SDN spend will continue to increase, what are operators reducing spend on? So they're reducing spend. So when they're doing equipment refreshes, they're trying to move more towards the new models. So they're phasing out a lot of the legacy, and they're migrating towards the new platforms. So we see that manifesting itself in we see that manifesting itself in the mobile core. Let's talk about mobile core specifically. So EPC, right? When LTE first came out, the operators bought EPC appliances. Now EPC is being virtualized. That functionality is being virtualized, and it's now residing in these edge clouds, right? So that's where the intelligence is residing, and then it's pushing out to all of the cell sites in that particular environment or location. So I think that's a good example of how a domain is being shifting over from a more traditional oriented architecture to more of a virtualized type architecture. So what you're going to see is black boxes, so like routers that have proprietary software tightly integrated with a proprietary hardware. Those types of appliances are going to be going away. Another example is firewalls. Firewall appliances, those shipment rates, if you look at how that market's shifting, the firewall intelligence is being virtualized and it's residing in the cloud now. A lot of these newer implementations, and the firewall appliances are actually disappearing. They're being migrated over to these new frameworks, and now there's less demand for actual physical firewall appliances. So the core and the firewalls, I would say, are two good examples of how this is manifesting itself in that shift from old world to new world. The next question is, services are 25%. It is a one-time job. Why services component remains the same and for how long? So services is very varied. There's different things in there. So there's everything from implementation to systems integration. There's consulting, advisory type services in there. There's outsourcing services in there. There's support type services in there. Why does the services component around 25% each year? When we did the models out and we looked at the configuration of what the demand profile should look like for these environments, services wound up being relatively stable around 25%, with software growing in the mix and hardware declining in the mix. So that's kind of how the numbers shook out. Now within services, there's a lot of gyrations taking place there. In the report that we have, we give that granularity to show some of the dynamics that are taking place on an individual service category level. But we weren't sharing that as part of this webinar. So the next question is colo playing in core network or support services? I would say it's more in the core network that it's playing. That's what I've been seeing. So the next question is, while looking at the business case for adopting NFV SDN, what are the revenue drivers? Aha. So two ways to think about this. There are there's two justifications for investing in NFV SDN from a telco perspective. One is they can sell new services, right? So like SD-WAN as an example. The other thing is they can leverage NFV SDN for their internal operations to realize the benefits that this new architecture provides. So the flexibility, the agility, the cost efficiencies that they obtain, the ability to differentiate from telcos that are not evolving, right? The ability to be more flexible with their service offers. So that's the competitive advantage component, the cost savings advantage that they obtain there. So I look at it as an internal benefit to the telco, and the revenue, so the spend reducing type benefits to the telco, and then there's the revenue producing benefits to the telco. The problem with the revenue producing benefits is NFV SDN has a cannibalization aspect to it. So if they're selling SD-WAN, what we're seeing is that that's cannibalizing the MPLS market. So there is this cannibalization factor that's taking place, and there's an expectation by end users that they're going to spend less money on these newer solutions. They're more efficient. It's easier for them to migrate and implement towards. So there's that factor as well. So the new technology is getting better, it's getting faster, and it's getting cheaper. And some of that cost savings is getting passed down to the end users of the telco. So there is that mitigating factor that needs to be considered as well. The next question is, which vendor is considered the market leader / thought leader, and are they the same? So it's hard to say who's the market leader because it depends on what you're saying market leader for. So if you're talking about consulting around NFV SDN, I would look towards the management consulting firms, the big four. I would look towards the leading IT consulting firms. Those are where we're seeing telcos going to for advice. In some cases, they will also go to OEMs like a Cisco and talk to their consultants, but it's mostly the traditional consultancy-oriented firms that they're going towards. That's also where we're seeing some of the thought leadership coming from. The vendors, the OEMs do have some thought leadership, but I think that the bigger picture items of where this is going and how the telcos can actually benefit from a business perspective, that thought leadership is coming from the management consulting firms. Okay, so let's move to the next question. And what % of NFV SDN will be delivered primarily by network equipment providers versus OEMs direct? So I think you mean ODMs direct. So traditional OEMs versus ODMs. So I definitely think there's a shift towards ODMs. So we are seeing some telcos procuring white boxes from ODMs in Asia. So Celestica, there's a few other companies that are also in there that are being procured from. But the OEMs are also going to be procured from as well. Going forward, I think it's going to be a mix with ODMs increasing in the mix. I think that they are the ones providing true white boxes, and the OEMs are providing hybrid white boxes. So they're not really a white box. It is a whatever shade of color you want to call it, gray, blue, whatever. It's not quite a traditional type box, but it has proprietary aspects to it. But it's a cheaper, it's a lower price point. It's using more commodity off-the-shelf type componentry. So it's kind of like a hybrid of the two. So yeah, both of those will be utilized in these environments. The next question is there a short-term spending hump involved in migration to NFV SDN as operators have to incur the migration cost and the cost to operate legacy network concurrently? So yes, there is. So what we're seeing is telcos are not, so they're having to run the old world and the new world stuff concurrently, and the time frames for them to be able to shut off the old stuff is getting pushed out. So they're in this tough situation where they're trying to migrate, they're trying to get the cost savings extracted as fast as possible, but the timelines are getting pushed out. What we're seeing them doing is they're pushing the vendors for more price concessions to mitigate that angle. So what I'm seeing is some of the telcos are pushing on the vendors for greater pricing concessions, so that they can get some cost savings as they try to fund these concurrent operations in their businesses. So the money has to come from somewhere, and someone's got to be left holding the bag. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the OEMs are getting hit with having to provide pricing concessions to the telcos on new equipment, on new solutions. It's not just the equipment in these net new procurement cycles. That's what we're seeing. Okay, I think that was the last question. So we've got 6 minutes left. If there's any more questions, feel free to throw those on. And if not, Sarah, maybe we can close a few minutes early.
Sure. Great, everyone. Please feel free to reach out to Chris or send an email to webinars@tbri.com with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, please fill out the survey on your screen and let us know what topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event, which you'll receive via email, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. Make sure to join us on Wednesday, July 11th for Wallet versus Will, Transformation of Government Technology Adoption. Thanks for joining and have a great day.